Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to this different edition of the MuslimCentric podcast. So I've got my guests here. I've got Shaykh Ruzwan, Mohammed, Osama Saeed, and Zara Mohammed. So firstly, I'd like to maybe just start with introductions. Just tell us a bit about yourself. So how would you kind of introduce yourself? So who wants to go first? Shall I start from my right?
I think the Sheikh should go first. No, that's fine. I can go. So I'm Zara Mohammed. I am the Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain. Born and raised in Glasgow. I think in this setting, very much with friends, but in my professional setting as the Secretary General, elected in 2021 as the first female, the youngest, and the first Scot to lead the organisation, MCB being the largest umbrella body for Muslim representative organisations.
Okay. And you've been through quite a journey, so I think we'll probably come on to some of that and your reflections on how that's been. Osama?
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. My name is Osama, and I work in communications and marketing. I've done that in a number of different fields, in politics and in Al Jazeera. I used to work out in Qatar as head of communications, and I've worked at various charities as well, including Amnesty International, where I was the global comms director.
And Shaykh Ruzwan?
Yeah, I'm Ruzwan, and I'm the educational director of iSyllabus.
Okay. And you're based in Istanbul at the moment?
Currently in Istanbul, yes.
You're lucky that you're visiting Glasgow. So
lucky. I am lucky.
Lucky. We are lucky as well. And I'm Aman, I'm your host, so you'll be familiar with me. So I'm a doctor working in Glasgow as a psychiatrist. So I think we're going to talk about lots of different topics today. But I think the one that is at the forefront of all of our minds is obviously Gaza and Palestine. So it's nearly 4 months since things, the conflict has escalated. And I'd be just really keen to hear your reflections of, what impact has everything that's been happening over the last few months had on you in your kind of day-to-day, in terms of your work, your employment, your personal life. So just kind of pausing and reflecting where we are with Gaza and what impact it has on your reflections so far. So I don't know who wants to get going. So you start with you, Zara, again. Would you mind? So I know MCB has been incredibly active as well. One of the things in your role is obviously you travel a lot around the country. So what's your kind of, if you have to pause and reflect in terms of how the last few months have been?
Yeah, Bismillah. I think sadly it's nearly more than 115 days now of the conflict and the siege. It's been relentless. I think the first month or two were the hardest hitting because we had so many different things to grapple with. On one hand, you're witnessing, unbelievable scenes of horror and killing, and we're watching on a live stream, which we're not necessarily used to, but in real time we are seeing the horrors that are happening there in Gaza and wider Palestine. So one part of the role was to make sure we were advocating for that, and then quite early on calling for a ceasefire, but I think anticipating that this was going to be a lot longer and a lot tougher than what we've faced before. The second part of that was dealing with the dehumanization of Muslims and of Palestinian advocacy and the stifling of that advocacy. So a lot of it was around frontline media, challenging narratives and tropes around Muslims being called bloodlust and death cults. And a lot of that was normalized even on shows like Question Time, who give platforms to certain commentators who said those things. And then at the third level was around what was happening here in the UK. And obviously communities have been ruptured by this, both in terms of, I'm sure we'll get into it, our relationships with politicians and with the political space, and that disappointment and disenfranchisement with our community leadership, including myself. We've all tried to do our best and do as much as we can. But I guess maybe this crippling reality that actually all the things we thought we'd build and the things that we'd done, and maybe we just weren't quite there yet in terms of how much of an impact we can make to challenge such narratives and tropes. So if I'm honest, at a personal level, it's been very, very difficult because people the expectation is high, delivery is even higher, but to keep a pace with what's going on, as well as to sustain your own self, has been difficult. But I always believe that there's still hope, and the positive of it is you've never before seen this much attention to the cause, this much global solidarity beyond faith and background, and also hopefully a much more strengthened political solution. But anyway, that's just a little bit from me.
I think there's a lot to reflect on, and we'll maybe come on to. I mean, Osama, what have you learned so far over the last few months in terms of your reflections and where we are?
I think same as Zara. There's multiple levels to this. There's a domestic and international, and of course, first and foremost, is for the Palestinians themselves. And overall, there's been a huge wake up call. I mean, I think I certainly had a feeling, and I'm sure I'm not alone, that over the last number of years we'd made progress on a number of levels on the Palestinian issue and prospects for peace and justice and security for everybody in the region and for Muslims more broadly. And I think in both those issues, it's been shattered on the Palestinians. You know, we'd seen cultural moments. We'd seen Mo on Netflix. We'd seen, I think it was Farhaz nominated at the Oscars. You thought, okay, there's real Palestinian solidarity rising. You could see concern amongst people that enjoy, occupying other people's lands, getting really worried about the rise of solidarity, the interconnection between Black Lives Matter, dispossession of native peoples, and the Palestinian issue. You could see that rising across the world, that feeling, and there was this kind of thing, as Martin Luther King says, that the arc of justice bends to the arc of humanity bends towards justice, and you could see that playing out. And then for it to be shattered in the way that it was, and I know this just speaking to so many people, that it's just left people feeling bereft. Obviously those in the region, but all those who value principles of humanity across the world, feeling, how can this be allowed to happen? How can people be supporting this playing with so many lives? Literally millions of people being corralled around this tiny bit of territory. You're told to go to the south, told to go west, told to move different coordinates, as if it's just some kind of sick computer game being played from above. But people are mobilizing. I think that wake-up call has made people rise to the occasion. I think there's weird things happening, but there's also really good and positive things happening. And I think people have taken a lot of heart from events at the ICJ over the last couple of weeks. There is an awakening happening, and all we can hope really is that people get respite very soon within the region, and we move towards peace for everybody around the world.
Yeah. Shaykh, your reflections and...
I mean, as soon as this happened, I did a series of podcasts on this with Zara Malik. So, and they were like timestamped to specific phases in the first month, I think it was. So initially, when what happened, we were processing it. I was processing it very raw because just before I went live with the podcast, I phoned one of my students who's now in Sheffield. He's a GP. He's Palestinian. He's from Gaza. And just want to touch base with him, see what's happening. And, he tells me there's a couple of his members of his family just been killed the day before, and he has to leave the call. I catch up with him after the podcast, and there's a whole section of his family killed. And so this is a student I've taught for a long period of time. He had hours and hours of classes, 4-hour classes back to back on Arabic grammar and logic. I remember I mentioned it to him as well, that after one of the classes, we finished a book, and the end of it was a signature of one of my teachers who I finished the book with, and it was the anniversary of his death. He'd been killed by the Shia militia in Damascus. His father had been hunted down, decapitated, and put in front of his house. And I reminded him at that point, which was about, I think this was at 2014, I said, I pray that this never happens to any of us. This type of bloodshed and carnage, that we don't see it. But the reality is the historical view of what's happening is a real view. I mean, there's the sense of helplessness that, that we've apparently built so much. We've got political leadership in the highest office in the UK. And for young people specifically, when I speak to young people, it's as if, look, what you people in your 40s and 50s said you've achieved isn't actually nothing. But that belies the fact that there's a historical view to this as well, which I think is the Quranic view, which is, it comes out in the story of the Prophet Musa and Harun, in which they pray to God and beseech God to destroy Pharaoh. And God says that I've accepted your dua. But in the books of Tafsir, it mentions it's 40 years until that dua is accepted. So one of the things about the current situation in Gaza is that there is the reaction to what's happening, and it has to be a real in-time reaction. And I think as humans, that's what we do. But there is a sense of the fact that we don't live just for this moment. We live true to our beliefs, our morals, and that cannot be negotiated. And you can comment every single day with what's happening, who's killing and who's saying what and what's the specifics, but I think you have to have some kind of moral viewpoint. You have to have some kind of sense of the historical push of history as well, how history is going. And you want to be on the right side of history. And whatever you're providing to whatever's happening, it has to fit into that context. So when I was doing those podcasts, one was about the specific events, then it was about the history, and then about the future. The future is complicated. And this is what I think we need to get out there, which I don't think is getting out there, is that we have to realize that the what is happening is simple. Like what is happening is you don't need to, have a specific moral bent to understand where right is and where wrong is. But the complexity is in the solutions. And I think there's not enough Muslim voices that are saying that this is going to be extremely complicated, and we can't just walk out the room without negotiating some kind of solution. That requires maturity. The problem with that is that the people that will make those points will be ostracized from the community. That's the problem. And that's where I'm kind of watching the whole discussion, is that I feel everybody's jumping on this kind of thing, that we're in the ascendancy, people are realizing what's happening. But the reality is, it's almost like being in the cage with a mixed martial arts fighter. You think you're able to do it, but once you get in, you realize you're going to get destroyed. And you can't just say, well, I should be able to destroy this person because I've trained. The reality is that's not going to happen. And I think it's a question of speaking truth to power. Unfortunately, it works not just to oppressors, it also works in terms of power here is also the majority. And I think in the Muslim community, there is a majority that relies simply on the fact that they're right, morally right. Being morally right does not get you the solutions that you need. So it's very complicated. You can see it's what concerns me and keeps me awake at night is the fact that somebody has to step up to this task and not just echo everything that we feel, that we think is the oppression.
I mean, what do you think the response of the Muslim community in the UK, has it been better than what you thought you would have expected, or do you think it's highlighted many of our kind of weaknesses and failures? Or, I mean, what's your sense of the response? Because I was reflecting, because the other kind of comparison I have, Zara, you're probably maybe a wee bit too young for it, is after the Iraq War, and the response of that. And I think we really caught unaware as a community. If you think about who our spokespeople were, and it was the same people who maybe couldn't speak much English, and it was all about Islam equals peace, and that was about as much as the argument was. And what we see now is online and viral people that are very eloquent and sometimes giving as good as they get. So you think, have we progressed in many ways? But then is countered with that, well, actually, we have Muslims in these senior positions now, in politics. 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have Muslim politicians really that were in these places. And now we've got, First Minister in Scotland, you've got a Muslim mayor in London, you've got MPs in the House of Parliament. And has that kind of test all failed? As we saying, well, okay, we had, 30 years ago, we would have said, we need people in these influential places. We need people in the media. We need people and we've got cultural icons, and we have a lot of these Muslims, but then, has that really pushed the needle? Did it make any difference? Because I my worry is that people, or there's some sections that are a bit disillusioned, a bit fed up, and are feeling, well, actually the hypocrisy, the whole, everything that we've been trying to work on has been a bit pointless because it comes to this, and even Labour can't stand out and call for a ceasefire. Basic justice that people are asking for, because even asking for the ceasefire, which, that's not the be-all and end-all, really, isn't it? I mean, that's just a starting point, and we couldn't even get past that. So, I mean, what's your reflections as a community? Where you get impressed? Are you disappointed? Does it show that we're still far to go?
I think being on the front line, I think the Sheikh very aptly has put the problem at hand. The community, in my caveat, limited wisdom and time, but steep learning curve of being the head of the organization is, I think the community operates in binaries and populism and simplicity, and, everything is different. So you can't deny, what, I guess my parents' generation or the generation before, the MCB successive leadership, everything has changed. So we are more articulate, we are more confident, but understanding how power works and decision-making and policy and comms, those are different things. And I think the simplistic thing is, as you said, it all became about a ceasefire, right? And when we were having conversations behind the scenes, politicians, rightly so, also made the point about, well, what about after that? What does it look like? What does the long-term peace look like? And also, to make everything about this one issue, we have to also look at everything else around it. So this issue impacted schools, employment. It impacted integration, interfaith. It's economics. It has how we shop, how we spend, but also it's tested faith as well, and people's reliance on Allah. So one of the few things people were saying is you should pray. That became like a soft answer, how dare you tell me to pray, we had, and see the challenge that I have being a representative is that you've got a spectrum of opinions. So we're a broad-based umbrella, and there'll be very strong views on what should be said and what should be done. There'll be more, then there'll be the other side of it. And then somewhere in the middle, a lot of really confusion, because people are emotional. And so I don't think it's right for me to say whether I'm disillusioned or not, because I think I understand more of the reality because I'm closer to it. But that same mirror was looked down at me. So on one hand, I was doing everything possible. I was recording extra videos. I was doing the news. I was doing the community engagement. We had the Palestinian ambassador on with 5,000 people online, trying to get community information. But, it's not enough, and I can't go and stop the fighting. And this has been an issue that we've been talking about for as long as I've been alive, and 75 years even at that. But also, it also is a question about who we are and what we're trying to get from all of this. I think the sad part of it is that lack of working together. And realistically, we've been quite divided in highlighting our division and actually using that also as a tool. I mean, we also have to admit that there's been a lot of opportunists that have come out of this. There's been a lot of clickbait content. There's been a lot of people who've taken that division. We've got people on interfaith, for example, or wherever it is. There's good, well-meaning people everywhere that don't like what they're seeing. But because things are political, they may not be able to say what they want to say. But we will then condemn that, right? And sometimes a quiet voice is also a good voice too. And so for me, I think it's just been very stressful. But all is that, and to conclude, you can only do your best, and Allah knows what you're trying to do. But things have changed, and I think in a positive way. And
we should probably say, we invited you here as Zara, not as a
I
MCB Secretary General. I don't know whether you can disentangle the two, but it's not
I think at a human
MCB
level, I know it's very difficult.
Viewer opinion, really. We're saying, just guess what you're experiencing.
Yeah,
and what your thoughts
but I
are.
think because I live that experience, But anyway, I appreciate the thought.
Yeah. Osama, maybe Zara will come back to this as well. You said one thing that we don't really understand how most of us don't really understand. I'm a doctor. I'm not really into politics and that whole domain of how these decisions get made. You've lived and breathed that. Both of you really in different ways. Obviously, very close to the S&P back in the day as well. So, I mean, what when you talk about we don't really understand what goes on behind the scenes or the levers of power, inside of working smarter, what would you say is the community doesn't really get or doesn't really appreciate? That if we were to be smarter about things, that might have more impact.
We're a young community, so there's a level of harshness you can have about this. And if I'm summing up the Muslim response over the last few months, the thing I go back to is this incident in Birmingham, where somebody who I presume was very well-meaning in supporting the Palestinian people thought that the thing that they can do is go down to local branches of McDonald's and set off rats inside the restaurant, not just any rats coloured in the Palestinian flag. And that was their protest. And what that says is a number of things. You could be described as immature. I think the police also described it as illegal, and the gentleman was arrested. But it also talks about helplessness. It was almost you could see it as a cry of anguish that I don't know what to do. There's nothing I can do, and we don't have the level of access that communities that are much more established have. We're getting there. If we look at the progress over the last couple of decades, it's been enormous. And you mentioned some of those areas of progress earlier, and I think that's just going to increase. And if I look back, you mentioned after the Iraq War, there were similar discussions of, these protests are all fine and well, but it's all very emotional. And is that enough? What's that achieving? And I was involved in that in those days. And what I see is people who I was there organizing those protests with are now in politics. They're working as journalists. They're working in the film media. They've got places because it was an awakening moment. I mean, there was a reaction that they had, which was effective at the time, but the long-term effect that it had on them was to up their game professionally, and also bring in some of those values into what they're doing. So I'm really hopeful when you see people engaging in the protest now, trying to make their voice heard, doing whatever they can on social media. These are the avenues that we have because, most people, we don't own a press, we don't run political parties. But I think we're getting there, and I think you're going to see a new generation coming into that and raising the game even more. And for those that enjoy war and destruction and almost seem to be reveling in the idea of further dispossession of the Palestinian people, that's what that really gets them fearful. Even though our message is one of not subjugation, is like the other side, it's one of love, of peace, of coexistence, that people can live together, and that is the only way this is going to be resolved. And to Shaykh's earlier point, that this has to be about finding real solutions. And I think as our maturity increases, I think you're going to see more and more of that emerge.
This is an open question. Anyone? I mean, if we were working smarter, or if we were wanting to be more effective, what could we do? What should we be doing? What would make a difference? Because a number of times, and I'm not saying disagreeing with all of this. So I'm just challenging the number of times I'm asked to sign a petition. And then you've got the rallies, you've got the vigils. There's so much that people are doing, and there's that activism, and is that good, or is there more that we could be doing that would be effective? And I guess part of that, I wonder, Shaykh, echoes with the challenges you probably have as a scholar, is people often want quick answers, or maybe rapid answers, and I know you've spent a long over a decade trying to say there's a long-term approach as well, about education, raising the standards of the community. There's not just like firefighting when you're in the situation, but actually building and thinking strategic and long-term. It's maybe not as glamorous, or people aren't, sometimes harder than just looking for the quick wins. I mean, how do you balance the two? What do you think? What's your reflections as a community? Do you think, well, this is good, you know, this is fine, or actually, what are we missing a trick here, or what should we be learning from?
Well, I mean,
the last few months?
in terms of just leaving aside all the political stuff, you look at your religious observations. Some of them are immediate, that you do all the time. There's prayers that you have to do punctually, and then there's certain things that you have to do yearly, and there's certain things you do seasonally, and then there's certain things you do in a lifetime. The fact that you have a long-term plan and you want to create some kind of resilience within the community and longevity does not take away from the fact that you also have to give some people something to do right away. So there is people who can't process the fact you have to plan for a generation into the future, that they need something now. And for them, you have to, as a religious scholar, but also as an activist, you have to, okay, do this thing right now, just do it, go there and do that. And you feel like you've done something, because that's part of our religious, I think our DNA as a community is quite interesting, because we know that everything's time specific. And there's certain things like Hajj that you do once that you're as if you're a newborn baby. So you've achieved something, but it's only once. You've got one shot and you need to do it properly. And I think with our thought leaders, we need to have the courage to say that to people. And also we have the facilities to say that this is something you can do right away. You can do your demonstrations, you can do all the engagement with politicians. You can also have, I think one of my main criticisms of the Muslim community is that they have tended to want to disengage with society and not create resilience and create that kind of infrastructure of professionals. And I think one of the main areas of that is in law, because I've said this so many times over a decade. People say, Shaykh, where should I go to study Islam? I said, no, you should go to a law school and do human rights law and then excel, because the impact you have by doing that and doing it well and doing it as a passion is much more than I'll be able to do as a scholar in terms of impacting people's lives on earth, in terms of getting their justice. Because essentially, the laws that we have, and this is something that is mentioned by a lot of very interesting scholars in the Middle East, like Imam Zuhaili, is that the creation of international law statutes, in a lot of ways, short circuits a lot of our thought about jihad, about our thoughts about Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Kufar, the kind of bipartite distinction between Islam and the West or non-Muslim lands. Because essentially, if you're able to project your voice and call people to what you believe is good freely in accordance with the laws of any land, and that's in fact what it is, you should not need to do anything apart from live and call for your rights. And if you're able to articulate that, then you should be able to get exactly what you want. And the Palestinian issue is one amongst many. And I think people say you don't need to go to university. If you need to take a student loan, you don't need to go to university. You can do whatever, you can just, but don't go to, you don't have to be a doctor, you don't have to be a lawyer. But then at some moments like this that you find that you do need to be a lawyer, but we need a critical mass of lawyers where we get the very best of the best. So it's not about having lawyers, it's about having people that, from that batch of lawyers, we have people that are critically engaged with the topics. And so for me, it's you have answers that are immediate. You have to have answers that are immediate, but you have to have generational answers as well. And you have to, in a sense, disengage from the day-to-day, the anguish of this moment. In a sense, again, that's a prophetic voice. And what I also feel is that the prophetic voice is disappearing from discourse. The more desperate Muslims become, the more the prophetic voice disappears.
What do you mean by the prophetic voice?
The prophetic voice is the voice, and this echo in our imagination that should be there is that, when the Prophet left Mecca al-Mukarramah, he turned back and he said, I would never have left if my people hadn't thrown you out. He comes back well over a decade later, coming in and not taking retribution, but not doubting the fact that he would be back, because he was on the truth. But he never forced it. Like, he didn't force taking back Mecca. He actually turned his back on it. And he was almost invited to come back. And we have to have that confidence. That prophetic voice of everything happens at a specific time. Sometimes you need to take a step back. You need to recollect your kind of, your power and your thought, and just take account of what you have and build for the long term. I think that is, especially in our day and age of social media and clickbait, that's disappearing. You can't make that voice heard. It's not possible because there's somebody there to, have a reaction video or some kind of refutation. And I would imagine the Prophet ﷺ, if he was here, there'd be Muslims refuting him. And this is the thing, I think the religious prophetic voice is missing. But the prophetic voice is also like, one of the things that I found fascinating about Sirah is the Prophet ﷺ, when he, during the Battle of Uhud, they've won Badr and then the Quraysh come back stronger and meaner. And the Prophet says, we should stay in Medina. And the young people, and Hamza radiallahu anh says, no, we need to go out. And the Prophet saying, no, you don't need to. And everyone else saying, okay, we'll stay here. But once they decide and say we want to leave, what he does is amazing, because he says, okay, I value your opinion, even though it's wrong. He goes in and puts not one coat of mail on, 2 coats of mail. And they see the fact that he's not putting 1 coat of armor on, 2. He's serious. And they said, no, we don't want to do it. But the Prophet engaged with them in their mistake. It was a mistake, and he allowed them to make the mistake. He could have said, no, we're staying here. And so in certain situations, we need to let people make their mistakes. But we need to point out to them what we learn from the mistakes. So I think, the thing about the people around this table is we need to have the courage to say these kind of things and not worry about the repercussions.
Zara, when you travel, I follow you on Instagram, so you travel a lot, you're always traveling and stuff and visiting lots of centres and mosques, etc. I mean, what's your sense of, I guess what Shaykh was talking a bit about in terms of, are people kind of engaged, thinking long term? Are you optimistic about, the community? I mean, I have to be honest, in the first few weeks, first few Jummahs after, the recent kind of conflict, our Imam didn't say anything about Gaza apart from in the dua at the end, and I'm sitting there infuriated. Almost one of the few times I thought I need to speak out because it's on everyone's mind. Everyone's so distraught. And I know we can't pigeonhole, there'll be good places and bad, but I'm just trying to get a sense of, as you travel, what's your kind of sense of some of the things that Shaykh was talking about in terms of,
Yeah, I know, it's such a good reflection. So maybe I'll broaden my travel a little bit before the So I've maybe visited over 300 kind of organisations, from Newport and Swansea to Aberdeen and Leicester, Blackburn, Liverpool, just to give the audience a flavour of like...
all the tropical places.
All the tropical places, yeah. All where there's a Muslim, and I think what's really...
Top of that 10.
And the biryani, of course. And I have sat in the Imam seat, which was actually, in the office. I was like, am I allowed to sit there? And I've sat at the front of the congregation. So yeah, they've let me in, which is quite good. I mean, to maybe make the conversation more holistic is the reason that we undertook those travels was to get a sense of, well, who are Muslim communities? What do they look like? What do they think about? And it's so diverse. It's really, really diverse, partly with the community that have been here generationally, but also the new intake, huge refugees communities. And we've all come from, I guess, different diasporas, and we've integrated. But from this 2021 census, 50% of Muslims born in this country are under the age of 15 or younger. That's in 2021, now eligible to vote and work. So they are the emerging workforce. But I think statistically, we're more British now, being more of us in the UK. So, I mean, what we see is a very diverse picture where the point that you're talking about, why didn't Imam speak? Well, if you're a registered charity, for some of them, it would be navigating, talking about a political issue when you're a charity. And that's why Charity Commission got involved, remember, with all that. So I can understand the hesitancy. We put a lot of guidance out about, some people didn't know what a prescribed group was. Some people didn't even know how to talk about it and what word they can say or that. But also I think, so on one side it's, you've got your traditional institutions, but there's also a growing kind of mental health, youth, young people, schools, and we have lots of institutions and lots of work. I think the trouble that we have is in building a Muslim civil society, which I think Sheikh was alluding to. There's some of us, shine out stars, and people have gone to do great things in sports or journalism or TV presenters or politicians or whatever. But there's just a lack of that kind of middle area of civil society. So, for example, we've got a huge section of our community that do charitable work. All of us in our own way, but the Muslim charity sector come Ramadan is going to be working 24 hours, yeah? We've got a huge section of our community in religious literacy, you could say, in the madrasas and the mosques and that kind of spiritual. And there's huge sections that do, I guess, in some ways, a service providing, hospitality, this business, hospitality or whatever. Very few in other spaces. And the reason that I say that is that's the trouble, right? When things like what we're talking about or other issues come about, we don't have enough connectivity to know how to navigate it. And we rely on that very small sliver to tell us what to do, only if we're happy with what they say, on condition, right? And so what I found, because obviously I was elected at 29, coming into an organization, and I think I now find myself like a 5.0 to a 2.0, so there was a couple of generations missing. So when I came in, I just saw the world very differently and rosy tinted. And, I knew those Uncle G, I don't want those interviews, let's change that, let's rebrand the website or whatever. But I think I was speaking to the audience that is of my generation younger, which is like, yes, we can. Whereas a lot of our community leadership is still figuring out if they're maybe British enough or if they want to be here or if they want to be part of society. Whereas younger lot aren't really thinking about that. Overall, the picture is very positive and our institutions are here and we're here to stay. The trouble is direction. And also understanding that difference is okay when we can get to the same place in different ways. And then I think there's also something around that diversity point, that diversity is really good for us. We need to lean in on that more. So scholarship's really interesting. So obviously I've got to meet all the different kinds of scholars, very conservative, and other different levels of conservative, I should say, but all the different branches and trees and everything else in between. And I think it's incredibly important and enriching to engage scholarship, but scholarship is only helpful if scholarship understands the world that it's operating in. And so at the same time, you have to balance that. So I might talk to certain scholars or imams about letting women in a mosque, but I might also talk about mental health and well-being and what are we talking at the minbar, what are we saying? And then at the same time, people attack the mosques, they're useless and that. I said, we pay our imams peanuts. Most of our mosques are run on a voluntary basis, as are organizations, yet we expect them to be pastoral carers, youth workers, chaplaincy. So what you want, you don't necessarily want to invest in. What you require, you're not facilitating. But somehow we have managed. And I think we're going to continue to be,
Zara, have you been to America? You've obviously seen the way that they deal with their religious institutions. And
it's incredible, yeah.
I heard about the pay scale.
They've got quite...
Tell us about America.
No, I just
quite a lot more, yeah. It's quite, it's very substantial pay. You could do quite well if you do.
Not just the pay, the infrastructure for...
It's all set up.
They planned the basketball court before the mosque, the musalla.
Yeah.
Not bad.
I mean, the Adams Center in DC is just absolutely incredible, yeah.
Osama, what are your thoughts on what you've heard?
Look, I think overall, my mind is very much on solutions. Where do we go from here? And some of this, just may not be possible because I see some of the statecraft that's been attempted by Saudi Arabia recently. What on the face of it seems like a smart proposal. Exchange hostages and prisoners. Israelis get released. Palestinians get released. The war stops. Palestinian state gets recognized as a result of normalization with Saudi Arabia. Like you can see a sort of whole set of chess moves, except the carrot within that for the Israelis is meant to be normalization with Saudi, when it seems that the administration in charge in Israel really wants Gaza much more than it wants normalization with Saudi. So that thing seems dead in the water. And I think back to theories of change, I think there's a huge element of lawfare And that speaks to everything that's been happening at the ICJ over the last few weeks. I think that's immensely powerful. But then the other real field of global attention, and by the way, I mean, just before I get on to global, there is this thing of some people saying, forget about the UK politics. It doesn't matter what Keir Starmer thinks. It doesn't matter what Rishi Sunak thinks. And to some extent in grand geopolitics, that is true. But it is still important as a representation of what this country is. And we live here, and we want to see the people that represent us and take decisions on our behalf have morals. And it is a problem if they don't. And it's especially worse, actually, if they're not even players. They're pretending to be players on the grand geopolitical chessboard. And in order to pretend, they take up really disgraceful positions. So I think UK politics matters in that sense, but not in the grand scheme of things.
So, and before you go into global, so just because I wanted to talk about UK politics and Labour, because it is in the news as well, that whether they're starting to get worried that the Muslim vote might not have it, or whether it's even important or not. I mean, what's your sense of what's going on with Muslims, particularly in England, and who they're going to vote for in Labour and everything that's going on with? Have they lost the Muslim vote? And then who are Muslims going to vote for? They're not going to bother voting for anyone? What's your kind of
It's a big problem for
sense?
the parties. And particularly Labour have commissioned polling on this now belatedly. It's going to be very hard to roll back, because once you've seen the leader of a party say that they don't care. I mean, this is a problem not just within the Muslim community. As soon as someone sees a potential prime minister say they don't care if a group of people don't have food and don't have water and don't have electricity, the message that goes out is this person could do anything to anybody. This isn't just a Palestinian issue. It becomes a wider issue. And this also is playing out in the US, where the people I'm speaking to in America are saying, look, we're not going out. We campaigned hard for Biden. And, when you consider the way the US politics plays out, there's 300 million odd people in the US, but previous US elections have boiled down to 50,000 voters in 5 states. It's that close. And some of those states are hugely Muslim areas like Michigan. So this is going to be consequential if Muslims are saying, okay, we're not going to go out and vote for Biden. And we're not saying we're going to vote for Trump. We're just staying home because we just can't take part in this charade. We can't bring ourselves, for someone that's overseen this number of deaths, funded it, supported it. There's no way we're getting involved. That's a problem. For the Democrats as well in the US. And I think, politics changes quickly. They've made catastrophic mistakes here. Can they fix it? Yeah. Nothing's ever irretrievable, but they're going to have to really try hard here, but they don't seem to be doing that so far.
Because is it not the same danger here that Muslims are, you spent decades saying get the Muslim vote out, it's important, all the campaigns, the re-election. A number of Muslims that I speak to in England say, well, we're not going to bother because we're totally disillusioned with Labour. I mean, even the Labour MPs, the Muslim ones, have been, calling out Islamophobia and racism and within the Labour Party, and then never mind the Conservatives. So, is there not that danger, and what's that implication then for the Muslims in this country as well, or not? Getting disillusioned in the whole system and not voting for anyone.
There's a difference between passivity and not voting. And that when I think about passivity, it's just I don't care. That's just all happening, and it's all rancid. I'm staying away from it. But not voting, you can still take part. There's going to be a campaign. There's going to be hustings. Turn up at events. Make your voices known. Get stuff on social media. Write to the newspapers. All of these things are taking part in that process and that festival of politics, which is about to emerge and lead up to elections on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think there's still ways that Muslims can make their voice known, and I think they will. I don't think this is going to go away. I don't think you're going to see a community just saying, look, I can't be bothered playing a part in civic society, as Zara was saying earlier. I think that's going to be there.
What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think it's so important to continue to engage. I mean, when all of this kicked off, we did a You Write to Your MP campaign with our tool. Over 230,000 people wrote to their MP, many for the first time, right? So political awakening is a good thing. I think we're obviously statistics and all these numbers and things,
So sorry, was that Muslims writing to
their MP, yeah. So we drafted a little letter, you put your postcode in and just
and
pushed
these
in.
are people that struggle to do anything, and they've done that.
We actually got 230,000 people engaged with that.
It's 10% of the Muslim community in this country. This is incredible.
Well, that's pretty good numbers. Let me put that in my final year report. Yeah. Okay. Pass the biscuits. So for me, that is powerful. And I think it's conflating people conflate the wrong kinds of negatives, right? So let's look even before October 7th, before Israel and Palestine. So if you look before it, okay, political apathy is rife in our community. So obviously MCB and many other organizations led on voter Muslim registration drives and turn out to vote and all the rest of it. So it's all there. And if you think about it, most of our community are very passive to it. Oh, it's fine, it'll be fine or whatever. We have an odd little Islamophobia, about counterterrorism, all the usual stuff, but people are just generally don't tend to participate. It's a cultural thing. We're not used to doing it. We don't think it's important. Gaza stuff happened, and now we've got a demand, right? With an MP we may or may not have engaged with a councillor, or with anybody in civic society. And so understanding how, there were mobs of people outside MPs' offices. There's a lot of intimidation, all sorts. And, people can protest. I'm not saying anything against that, but I'm saying is that, understanding how to utilize not just your vote, but everything that happens before and after it's important. So we're going to be still doing voter registration drives. We're still going to be doing the manifesto and the pledges and all those things. But I think it's about political literacy and getting out of political apathy, which is not going to be just on this issue. Because if you really ask people, how much do you know about this, the policies? Okay, what are all the manifesto pledges saying on Palestine and recognition? But what else are they saying on other things? And so I think it's even more critical to continue to engage. Obviously, that doesn't mean you need to support or not. I'll leave it to people to decide what they want to do and rightfully hold MPs to account, because that's they're paid for by the public. But I think it's important to understand we don't just condemn people and write people off or write political parties off, because how many of us have been members or are members? So I think we're on a journey. As Osama said, we're a really young community. We should know how to feel empowered about our voice, but also be conscious of our reality. And I think it's a difficult one, particularly with this issue. This is a very this is a life or death issue, actually. This is one of the most hardest ones to tell people, oh, you should just, so I can't just say, oh, just engage. But I think it's being mindful that does engagement only happen at this general election? So I think there's a lot more to think about.
Check.
A lot to think about. At what point do you introduce?
You're going to drop some wisdom down.
Because this the slightly cynical perspective is, look, is it not a danger that the Muslims now are saying, well, look, okay, we've seen the double standards again, right? With how were the Ukrainians treated?
The thing is to pinpoint on what basis is there double standards.
But it's, if you look at the number of narratives that double standards, and we can go into detail of that, then Islamophobia and the hostility amongst refugees and asylum seekers and the media, and the kind of, we've been here before, and now we've even had Muslims, compared to 30 years ago, we've got Muslim MPs, mayors, etc. And I think there are people feeling, well, actually, and the shift in global politics to other countries, South Africa's made this move, the BRICS, countries, are, the shift in global power is saying, well, actually, economically, even Britain, everything else is kind of, heading a certain way. And so I wonder whether a lot of Muslims or a number of Muslims are feeling disillusioned now to say, well, actually, we're next as a community. We've tried to engage. We've tried to get, do all the things that we've been encouraged to do. And, we still can't influence. The fact that, we have senior people in Scotland that are at the top of their, two Muslims in charge of the parties. And even despite that, it can't necessarily change, Keir Starmer's view on even calling for a ceasefire, to say, well, actually, how much more influence and power are we really arguing for? Because even despite that, the outcome's not really changing. So I just worry that there could be a sense of disillusionment, and people are saying, well, and my worry is, do you think that could lead to anger and going back the way to those things we saw a number of decades, about that radicalization, marginalization, people wanting to now, just react in a more militant way, and because we saw that after 9/11 and after Iraq, for a number of years. Or do you think that's just totally misjudging?
No, I think we haven't taken stock of the degree of disillusionment amongst young people, and I think that's yet to be understood, because there's such cosmic, systemic shifts taking place, much more than the Iraq War, much more than anything, even 9/11, not because of the degree of violence, but because of how it's opened up very clear breaks within the Western narrative of who they are, which is the problem. It's not about who Muslims are sure who they are. They believe in a moral code. They believe, like when this thing happened on October the 7th, before having to think about it, I was doing this podcast with Zubair. I said people who were signed up to Hamas would not have done X, Y, and Z. I know that for a fact, because I can see their faces, and they would never live with themselves if they did that. Did it happen from other people going in? That's a different thing, but they would never have done these things. I know that because they have a moral code. I think the problem now is young Muslims, and even people that are older, they're thinking, well, the West, the people that we looked up to, the most critical voices in the West, like Jürgen Habermas, like the second generation Frankfurt School. Frankfurt School was set up to answer the question, why did the proletariat not take over and gain power from the capitalists, bourgeoisie? And they basically said it was because of the fact there's entrenched structures in place that stop that natural process taking place. And so they were answering the question, how do we do that? It was basically around the issue of communication, and that the capitalist system controls how people think through controlling the public space. So Habermas is at the forefront of that idea of the public space being where all the civic society is, and everyone gets to say what they want, and impacts policy, impacts war and peace. And then he comes up with a statement, I think 3 weeks ago now, basically saying the German people have an absolute requirement upon them to support the state of Israel regardless of what happens, meaning that you shout down Palestinian demonstrations, voices within German society in the public sphere that speak in favor of Palestinians. And this is the same person that Muslims have been using for all their kind of social justice, kind of initiatives. And all of a sudden you see that the person who is the kind of mastermind of what we've been using to press for our case to be heard is now clearly doesn't understand his own ideas. And once that trickles down, that's going to be dangerous, because once that trickles down, you realize that this whole idea that you can fight for your rights that are given to you within a civic context, that they're not going to be given to you. I think at that point, the disillusionment will be real. And the propensity to radicalization, once it trickles down, will be far more than anything we've ever seen.
I think people are also taking hope. I think that disillusionment risk is real, but the people are also taking hope from the people that are speaking out about what's happening. And, you see prominent members of the Jewish community have come out in all the countries around the world. And it's incredible, when, in the Muslim tradition, speaking out for the truth, even if it's against yourself, is something deep within our core beliefs. And to see other people doing it as well is just
fascinating in this episode, the Jewish voices. Yeah. Being ostracized from their own community for being self-hating Jews. I mean, it's just been
there's so many,
humbling. Yeah,
there's
absolutely.
so many people like that now. They're not ostracized. They're a community in themselves. And one of my abiding memories of this entire few months will be that movement of, and it was Jewish activists going and occupying train stations seemingly spontaneously. It was just such a visible thing. Like the likes, we've never seen protest scenes like that. It was really ingenious in the iconography of it. So I think, there's cause for disillusionment, but also I would urge young Muslims and anyone feeling that, also look that there are people supporting the causes of truth and justice. Let's join forces.
So there's a question, I think, amplifying that type of episode in New York, for example, to the people that are open to being disillusioned. My fear is that they live in bubbles, and the YouTube clips they watch and the social media they follow doesn't allow that kind of narrative, which is very, 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 very optimistic. Because essentially, I think if you go to the Palestinian Jewish conflict, the key component here is the Jewish people and that community coming to terms with its own trauma. Because if they can come to terms with their own trauma, they can realize that the only way of releasing themselves from what happened in the Holocaust is not to inflict that on other people.
You see that people like Gabor Mate, isn't it? It just gives really iconic, talks about this. Sam, were you going to say anything else?
I think this is really profound. And I think it's important for us to internalize this, that what we're engaged here is the business of persuasion. What Israel is able to do is brute force. It's one of the most powerful militaries on the planet. It can act seemingly with impunity. What we have is not access to that. What we have is the ability to persuade others and them that that's wrong. And I think this is where I think we've got to think about our theories of change. I think the UK, so the UK situation is important. The US situation is important. But if we play back to what's the thing, and in NGO charity speak, you talk about the theory of change. What's the theory of change here?
So can you just, for people that don't know what that is, can you explain?
Theory of change, you want something to happen. How is it you're going to make it happen? And if, let's say, what we want is for everybody between the river and sea to live in peace and justice and equality, how is that going to be achieved? And you could take a view that I think a lot of people do, that what we've got to do is persuade the United States to bring its forces to bear, not so much militarily, but certainly political pressure to make change. Personally, I think that there's not a lot of evidence to say that that will happen, because there's a whole load of movement that you've got to do domestically within the US, which would take a huge amount of money to pump into the political system, and a lot of cultural baggage and right-wing lunacy that's going to be very hard to shift. And you're talking millions and millions of people that you're trying to influence there. So I think that's, and what Biden's shown is that, by the way, Biden's gone and tried both strategies. There's been a lot of criticism, rightly, of Biden over the last few months. But Joe Biden, I think, was also scarred by being sent by President Barack Obama 10 years ago when he was Obama's VP. He was literally sent to Israel and told to tell Netanyahu, stop building settlements. Just stop it so that we can try something in terms of long-term sustainable peace. He flew in, gave that message, and as soon as he flew out, Netanyahu did what? He said, build more settlements. So what Biden learned from that, I think, for this time was he tried to hug the famous, infamous now, hug Bibi strategy. Hug him close, make him feel wanted, make him feel loved, and therefore we might have influence. And what that's been proven is that doesn't work either. And you don't have the comfort of at least having the moral high ground. So what that tells me is America is actually not influential here. There's a lot of posturing. You've got Blinken going around trying to speak to lots of people, trying to be relevant, but nothing seems to move Bibi except one thing potentially, which is Israeli public opinion. And what I think people that love and peace and justice have got to think about is that what we assume is what America does and covert spy agencies as they go and meddle in other countries. As I said, Blinken's flying around the region, social media's pumping in messages, there's disinformation campaigns. That's the way the world is working. And that's how great powers are making shifts. And if the people who love peace and justice are also a great power, which I think they are. We've got to think carefully about this, because actually the easiest way to a solution here is persuading the Israeli people that something different is possible. And if you take Israeli public opinion, there's about 10-20% who are peaceniks. They're with this agenda. You've got 40% on the right, 40-50% maybe, who are in for the settlements, in for taking over Gaza. But you've still got 30-odd%, which is growable in the middle, who are just worried. And to Shaykh Ruzwan's point, there's a complex here, and I think Muslims have got to understand this deeply. There's a deep-seated trauma within the Jewish community, which is rational. We've got to be clear about this. 6 million people were gassed during the Second World War. That was not that long ago. Centuries of pogroms across Europe, and Jewish people are brought up with this. They know about this, and they should, because this happened. So this is within them, and when they see things like October the 7th, that brings all of that to the fore. And any people have a self-preservation tendency. That's what makes us human, and that's what makes us alive. We look after ourselves, and we've got to think about, okay, how is it that reasonable opinion within the Israeli Jewish community can have those fears? How can they feel confident that they can live in peace alongside the Palestinian people? What is it that needs to happen? And what we're talking about here is probably about 3 million people that need to be persuaded. That's a doable project if it's thought about that way, that middle opinion, with the right messages, with the right kind of targeting, the right kind of campaign, I think augmented with all the legal activity. This really needs to be thought about much more deeply than it has been the case up till now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's leverage, legal leverage, and I mean, my thing is where we're active is essentially, if we were thinking, it's not where we need to be active. That issue of persuasion is just a no-brainer, because the community that's inflicting this is a traumatized community, and as you said, a lot of Muslims will not want to hear that, and there's rationale behind it. But also for us as a community that wants a settlement and a closure to this for the Palestinian people, we have to be able to facilitate that in some way, get that message out as well.
And what's your sense then of the whole normalization that was happening or still happening with Saudi and UAE, etc.? What's your sense whether that, I mean, was that part of that idea of giving them security? Is that something that, because Muslims have there's lots of opinions about what's happening in Saudi Arabia, a lot of the 2030 vision, and so what's your sense where that fits into all of this?
I think that fitted in with Mohammed bin Salman basically said this. I think this is in relation to climate change, but he said, look, if something's going to give me 0.1% of GDP growth, then I'm going to do it. Mm-hmm. And I think it was in that category. I don't think there's a whole bunch of growth there between trade normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But the interesting thing that happened before October the 7th and after is that before October the 7th, that normalization thing was happening over the heads of the Palestinian people. What I found talking to Saudi insiders after October 7th is that whole thing was repositioned. So what they were saying was, look, if normalization happened, of course, a peace deal with the Palestinians and recognition of a Palestinian state was going to be part of that. Now, I don't remember that being part of any discussion before October the 7th, but that's what now seems to have emerged. What the Saudis seem to be saying after Antony Blinken's visits is, okay, normalization could be on the table, even after everything that's happened, but basically the price has gone up, and that's going to have to be, and I think they need to change the language, because the language they're using at the moment is there'll be a pathway to a Palestinian state, whereas I think, especially given they're going to be asked to foot the bill for reconstruction, and that's going to be a hefty bill, I think what they need to be saying is not pathway, because that's too fuzzy. It needs to be Palestinian state, US recognition, EU recognition, alongside, by the way, the rest of the world does recognize a Palestinian state already, but we need that recognition because it comes with some trappings. We'll reinvest. we'll do some normalization, because a lot of Arab states and Turkey already have normalization. Saudi Arabia will join that cohort, and that can be something of a sustainable way forward. But it also needs to go with confidence building and bringing people together, and a lot of thought needs to go into the grand strategy behind that as well.
And Shaykh, you've spent a lot of years in Arab countries. You're in Turkey now. What's your sense of where these Muslim countries fit into all of this, and whether that is something palatable, and whether public opinion will accept it, whether that's, what's your sense whether...
Well, I mean, I was in Damascus, and I think we used to mark apparently the date when the Syrians defeated the Israelis in the Golan Heights, when I knew very well that they lost the Golan Heights on that day. And so their sense of history, reality is slightly skewed, and that's not just Syria; it's all around. But I think what's interesting is the idea of normalization. I think Muslims don't understand what that means, because it means that you can take to task on behalf of being equals in a way you couldn't if there wasn't normalization. Normalization is not accepting them as an oppressive state. It's opening up the channels within which you can challenge them. So I think even if you agree or not, the whole point is you have to understand what it means to normalize. And what I think the kind of, especially in the West, the kind of social sphere of influencers present it as is selling out Islam or siding with the oppressors. And the simplification of the discussion is obviously going to trickle down. And so if you say, okay, let's think about normalizing, it means that you've got, blood on your hands. It becomes quite gruesome at some point. So there's no thought going through this. Normalization is a process through which you can actually take people to task, take states to task. A lot of conventions come into play as well once you normalize as well. So it seems to be natural that you normalize, especially on the basis that you know that state will remain there. It's not going to go anywhere. So there is this sense that people think, well, it will disappear, or we will make it disappear, or there's a sense that we're waiting for Salah ad-Din Ayyubi to come and he will take it back. Do you understand? That's not how it works. And the thing for me is that's not how our fiqh works. That's not how the seerah understood the world to work. That's what's frustrating for me, is that the voices that are coming out and normalizing this kind of discussion are religious voices that say it's treachery to talk about normalization. It doesn't mean I'm saying normalize. I'm saying you have to understand what normalization means. And for me, that's from a religious perspective, from our texts, and not based upon some kind of theory about critical race theory, or some kind of theory about granting rights to people without a religious kind of underpinning.
Zara, you got any thoughts in terms of...
Oh, yeah. I think we've got the global experts here. What I thought I would pick on was the non-Muslim world. And I think Osama made some really good points that, and Shaykh too, regarding narrative. So what we see as clickbait material is what tends to feed a certain narrative about the world and how it works, and what tends to make us feel comfortable. So the Muslim world has failed, okay, but when did it really work? We neglect the fact that not like over 100 countries want ceasefire. We neglect global solidarity. We kind of we like it, but we don't resonate it deeply, which is the message that we're a minority community that works well with others if we actually work with them. And many people who love peace and justice are on this journey with us. Many people want a Britain that actually they're not looking at that on their television screens. And many people are very concerned about where the world is going. And so normalization in a different context is actually about not making people out to be bad guys or villains because they haven't liked or shared or posted. I remember someone said, you've been really quiet on Palestine because I hadn't put an Instagram story up in a while. So people like your silence, and I think being able to work with other communities is very important, but also understanding so many people care. because it's innate in a human being to care. And what we're seeing is, this wholesale destruction. You're thinking, well, how can people like that possibly do that? But as you said, it's hardwiring. It's a little bit deeper than that. And then also questions around the Muslim world. We do also associate that with a couple of countries who are the Muslim world, but it's much broader. I mean, I also did international relations and law and stuff. So I think, but sometimes that can estrange our communities, and maybe some of the listeners. It's getting too complicated now. What are the simple realities? And as you were saying, what are the solutions? What are the way forward? And I think one thing is about perspective. Are you really open to all perspectives, or is it just the one that makes you feel comfortable? And, navigating thought is about being a little bit uncomfortable and challenging your perspective. And so, for example, we can all agree in terms of human rights abuses and what's going on. It's literally called occupied territories. So international law even agrees, right? So that's agreed. Where we're in some ways disagreeing is our approach to justice, or our approach to the reality, or whether, as you're talking about things like the Holocaust, whether we want to internalize that or not, whether we want to, and also our expectations of the community and its leadership and its scholarship. So for some scholars, they may be responding to what the congregation is telling them they have to say, or it could be their own philosophy and where they're coming from. But I think ultimately, in terms of the road ahead and the journey forward, a general election could or could not be imminent, but things are going to change in the political leadership in this country. What's not going to change is that we're still going to be here talking about this stuff and other stuff like it. So I was listening to another podcast, and someone was saying that Amazon does this and other companies. They don't look at what's changing. They look at what doesn't change. People want cheap prices and fast delivery. You have to look at what doesn't change. We're always angry about something. We're always going to have a conflict or a disaster. We've been taught to be reactive and responsive. So when it's quiet, we're just, all right, it's fine, everything's good. So I guess the point that I'm trying to get at is the learning of this. The journey forward is still going to be complicated, and we're going to have to navigate, and it's not in our hands. But I think for the first time, we saw that America, the US, and a few others are very isolated from the global reality. So that's very clear. But the second thing is, what doesn't change is that we are still a minority. And actually happily so, in the sense that, it's not a Muslim country, but we've lived really well here, and we continue to live well here. Islam flourishes very well in the UK. So that has to be then a strength to building better. And so 20 years ago, this response would have been really different. How we would have handled it would have been really different. Now we've got a growing and emerging younger generation who have to, in some ways, be wanting to take part, wanting to step up. And the question I always say to my lot is, well, they're all going to say, well, what's in it for me? Why should I step forward? And I think that's kind of the interplay of where I was looking at it.
And if I can just go on a slight tangent for a short bit, is you spoke a bit about, I guess, what hasn't changed, and one of the big things is obviously media, and you've done a lot of media work throughout this time, isn't it? I mean, what have you learned the most about your engagement with them? Because we've always brought up, for the last, Shaykh will know, Osama will know, many, many decades saying it's all the media, and we've seen that change a lot now, and we've seen a lot happening just now in terms of, you've obviously got the mainstream media, then you've got all these kind of alternatives, now you've got, online and social media, and we've touched upon about, the whole idea of, clickbaiting, and that's massive. You got Piers Morgan stuff that totally blew up. You got Bassem Youssef, all of these kind of things that have really massive. I mean, and you've done a lot of media before this, I think, which is your own other story, is when you got MTV and you were kind of obviously on the radio.
Women's Hour,
and that kind of all just kind of grew. And I'll come on to Osama as well, because obviously this is your domain as well in terms of PR and media. But what have you kind of learned? What's your reflections on what needs to change? Or because I guess there is that kind of longer term thing as well. How do we get our narrative out? What is our message as Muslims in this country? And how do we build bridges, etc. So I mean, what's your reflections about?
Yeah, I think when I got this whole space, I think when I got elected, baptism of fire, because at Women's Hour Radio 4, I mean, I was averaging about 9 interviews a day. becoming famous.
many?
About 9 interviews a
9
day.
interviews a day.
Yeah, so it's quite a lot. Everybody wanted a piece, and I didn't know I was famous, and became a public figure in like an hour. So
Because you're female as well as Muslim, and that was the other big.
I think people
thing,
couldn't
wasn't it?
comprehend how mainly imams and men had voted like a young 29-year-old from Glasgow as the Secretary General of the Muslim Council. But maybe, and I think MCB maybe a little stagnant, so it was like a big breaking news story. Generally speaking, at that point, a lot of the media was positive, but there were pockets of it which were just not having it. And that's where I had that really hostile interview. But I also had commentators saying I was a pleasant face away from a cross-eyed bearded man. So, and I quote. So I think at the start, what I realized was we had changed, but certain segments of the media had not. And as I fast forward to today, it's still such a powerful machine. It's so powerful in narrative and spin. And I think what I've realized in the 3 years I've been in term is that media has very strong narratives on Islam and Muslims, and they haven't changed, actually. Even the better bits of media are not. They only come to us for Islamophobia, counterterrorism, immigration, like really negative stuff. We don't really have any other topics that we talk about. And Ramadan, of course, and we'll give that.
I was in BBC News, 6 o'clock news, about an old copy of the Quran found in the Cadbury collection in Birmingham. It's a positive story.
That's a pretty nice one. We do get some of the historical wonders. I'll give you that. But generally speaking, the hot button ones are always not very nice. And then with this Israel-Palestine stuff, it was like there was a very strong media machine ready. And I think what we all realized was the PR at the start was it was focused on stifling any pro-Palestine advocacy, because they knew was coming, but it was also dehumanization in a very strong way. And I did an interview where I was asked about Hamas 5 times. Do you condemn Hamas? So, well, I'm a British organization that represents British Muslims. So what have I got to do with a foreign entity? But what's your line on it? So we condemn the loss of all innocent life. But what? And it just went on. I was just like, because the issue was we are being conflated with what? And why are you asking me about this? And it's that whole, again, you're positioning certain things together. So I think the only thing, though, that was really exciting and different was the growth of social media and the journalists everywhere in the world and in Palestine and in Gaza. And there's been some remarkable stories that have been shared, because then what happened was your Sky and your BBC and all the other outlets were having to follow their stories because they were trending. So they had to cover it. They still had their own little words and stuff. So even yesterday, there was the shooting in the hospital, the death squad. And then Sky had it on, and then BBC had it on. So they would never have covered this kind of story before. So I think things have pushed it, but narrative is very difficult. And what I would say is that, we're all traumatized in that respect of wanting to take media interviews. There's not that many of us that want to do it, and there's no coming back once you do it. So I understand where people are at, that they're not necessarily putting their hand up saying, yep, I want to take on the media, because there's no such thing as a easy interview. You might do okay, but you never know what's coming. And I've had that other side of it. But the other thing is that when we do it really well, it's so powerful. And I think the Palestinian ambassador has been one of the great, I think probably just articulate, confident, he just smashes it. And there's been some others like that. But you saw Piers Morgan is such an interesting one. I was saying to a friend, I was like, who's playing and who's being played? Because you think with his show, we all kind of end up tuning in, especially when he had some very, and you're kind of like, he's getting lots of clicks and likes and follows, and his ratings are going up. But then we're all really angry at him. And then people are, and now it's kind of turned into some other little drama. So there's this argument of every platform is important, so we should take it. There's also an argument of sometimes it's better to not take it if you can. And
have you been invited on?
I have not.
Wow.
I know. Thankfully.
Piers Morgan, if you are listening.
No, Piers. I don't think I'm ready.
Would you go in?
I think it just depends, isn't it? See, this is the thing, though. I always think, can I give a benefit if I go on it, right? I'm gonna just say I'm not gonna be crazy on there. I'm not gonna fight with him. I don't think I'm gonna give him what he wants, which is a riled up, frantic, crazy,
Osama, as a PR, from
Would you
a PR
recommend-
perspective, would you advise Zara if she was invited to go in or not?
I wouldn't advise anyone to go on Piers Morgan show.
Why? The Bassem Youssef thing was his satire,
But
everything.
he
That
was brilliant.
That was brilliant, wasn't it? That was.
It depends what you're trying to do. The Bassem Youssef thing was entertainment.
Yeah.
And it was some things that people agree with him love to hear. They love the argument. They love the cut and thrust. Did it persuade anybody? I'm willing to bet no, it didn't. Because the whole thing, the Piers Morgan phenomenon is fascinating because it is a result of social media algorithms. So what he's figured out is, I think it's actually broadcast on Sky News Australia, but everyone thinks it's a YouTube show. And what he's figured out is that, look, my brand of bombast and argumentation is heaven sent for these algorithms which favor disputation and people shouting at each other in a studio. This isn't winning hearts. It's not winning hearts. It's not winning minds. If you want entertainment, that's all it is. It's entertainment fluff, but it's not the serious business of change making.
So deliberately just so that he can get sound bites that will go viral.
Get sound bites.
100%.
People who agree with it will share
It's
it.
polar.
Taking it further, people who disagree with it will foam at the mouth and also irately comment, which makes it go further. And Piers Morgan makes lots of money.
Yeah.
That's all that's happening there. And yeah, Bassem Youssef has made a name for himself, but is this helping? This is not helping. And that's the counsel I would give, is that if anyone's thinking of going on, just realize that you're part of a game. But if you're going on as a serious change maker, the risks are high and the benefits are very questionable.
Well, we saw, the GP Abdul Wahid that went on, and obviously that's his livelihood and everything's been affected and being reported, so it has grave consequences. One thing that we've spoken a bit about, Osama, is, and Zara kind of introduced that, is about the Muslims need a message, and you've spoken, and I think it's more linked to some of our discussion about Islamophobia. But, you spoke very eloquently about a message, a messenger, how we kind of influence things. I mean, do you want to say a little bit around your thoughts in that kind of area? Because I think that's quite fascinating in terms of what is the narrative of Muslims in this country or worldwide, and what we need to grapple with and how you influence change,
I think we've been talking about Islamophobia for a long time. And we have suffered Islamophobia in the way that it's been defined. I think the way we've gone about tackling it is wrong. I think we've tried to adopt the approach that's used to tackle anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, of course, real, disastrous consequences over the centuries. But because it's been real for such a long time, with those consequences during the Holocaust, Second World War, there's an awareness of that, and also a special guilt that's felt within Europe about that. And there should be a guilt because of that. Muslims can't adopt that tactic because that same history isn't there. And even if people point to colonialism and millions of people dying in India, it's just not seen in the same way. The education level isn't there. And to get people up to that level of awareness will take a long time. And most crucially, this isn't the tactics that sit within the Islamic tradition. The Prophet ﷺ didn't, after he was expelled from Mecca, he didn't arrive in Medina and start writing reports about Islamophobia to nearby tribes. He sent messages to nearby tribes, but they were with a message of hope, humanity, of emancipation, of the future in this life and the next life, that were attractive. And that's what galvanized Islamic civilization to where it ended up. And that's what I mean by a positive narrative, that if we're going to tackle, there's a classical thing in messaging that, and actually I think I'm quoting Mad Men here and Don Draper, which is if you don't like the narrative, if you don't like the story they're telling, change the story. And that's what we've got to do. But for that, we've got to know what that story is. And I think one of the things, I'm grappling with what is that story. And I think we've got to think, what's that positive, hope that we can give humanity, which is feeling bruised and battered at the moment. People feel left behind. They feel that there seems to be so much promise in the world for so few people. What about us? Why is it that we can't get a toehold? Why don't we have basic dignity here? Why is it that, I saw Gordon Brown on the television a week or two ago, and he seemed to be proudly trumpeting this idea of multi-banks, that rather than getting away from food banks, we'll augment the food bank, so it will also be a clothing bank and a nappy bank and all sorts of, and he seemed really pleased that this will be a massive step forward for society. And I just thought, this is not dignity. This is not what the British public were brought up to believe is their lot in life. So I think Muslims got to think about this deeply. I think we've got an possible economic prescription to this. We've been kind of tiptoeing around the Islamic finance agenda for a long time and what that might mean in terms of bringing social justice in this country and across the world. I think there's a spiritual message, and I think people are looking for meaning. There's so much talk about what is consciousness in relation to artificial intelligence, that things can be created, and who are we? And I think people have a deep-seated desire for answers which potentially faith can provide, but for that we've got to have cogent, attractive things to say that connect, and there's people that can test these things, hone these things, and get them across. And I think we've just got to get much smarter about that, so that if people do go on the media, whether it's Piers Morgan or anything else, that actually the thing I notice when I'm seeing so many of our people is that they're all saying different things. Even on Gaza, right? There isn't a kind of thing. And certainly on just generally when we're asked questions about a whole array of things, that you'll get 100 different questions, you get a million different answers, and there needs to be something of a thread running through that, and I think that's something that we need to develop.
Yeah, it's fascinating actually. Shaykh, your thoughts on, we spoke about media, we've spoken about some of this messaging, other things. What are your kind of thoughts and your perspectives in terms of?
I mean, they're all controversial, so I don't know if I can
sum up in 5
minutes.
You won't get cancelled.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, no. So, I mean, I did a course on the art of persuasion.
Because I think just to give it context, I think, and not being biased, I think one thing people appreciate about you, Shaykh, is that it's taking things from a very different perspective, and maybe a deeply thought that maybe what we get from some of our other religious leaders, and I think that's what we need to hear a wee bit, because I think there's a certain insight that you have and reflections which I think are important to get across. So you can be as controversial as you want.
Everything that was being said there had some. I wanted to kind of interrupt.
Please do.
I had a thought too on one, but I think
I wish you had interrupted me. Actually,
Osama pinged a thought in my head too.
It was interesting. It was agreeable interruptions. I think in terms of messaging, I think what's important here is courage. And in terms of the whole concept of Piers Morgan, I think with messaging, it's all about you have to pin down who you're speaking to. So in a studio, are you engaging with the interlocutor, or are you speaking beyond them to the person watching, to the consumer? And I think the big mistake that I see, which is a cardinal mistake, I don't know, you're the expert here, Osama, and you're the practitioner,
the student,
the theoretician, and the
student.
It's that's the person you're speaking to, and you're almost looking through, or it's almost like this kind of, hopefully a smooth martial arts move where you're just bypassing the person into the living room of Janice, who's 65, never seen a Muslim, and she says, "Wow, I love these people." That's the whole purpose, and that comes from the prophetic method. That the Prophet would be sitting with a whole group of people, and he would bypass all of them to speak to the person in a way that everyone didn't want him to speak. Like they would get angry, like they would be assaulting somebody, and the Prophet would say, "Leave him alone," and he would speak to them, and they're watching, and he would communicate with that person. And if you're honest in the communication with that person, everything around you, even your interlocutor, will realize they need to change the way they engage with you. And I think that's really important, that we do have, I think, very deep kind of sense, a very deep sense of origins of communication from the Prophet ﷺ. Like there is something very deep in the way that he communicated and persuaded people, because it is persuasion. It's about getting somebody who doesn't want to do something that you want them to do for their benefit. And if it's for their benefit, they'll realize it and they'll perpetuate it. I think that's, in terms of communication, that's really important. I think the medium is the massage, is it? Or the message? That is very important. You have to represent what you're saying. But in terms of the narrative, what Osama was saying is absolutely true about Islamophobia and how we place that within the civic sphere, how we discuss ourselves and make sense of ourselves. And what I think is happening, and I've done a whole course, I don't know if you did the course in Islam in the West, whole section on Islamophobia and how it mirrors the definitions of anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism narrative and the definitions have gone through the same kind of iterations that we're going through now in terms of Islamophobia. The iterations of anti-Semitism, the AHRA definition is actually targeted towards the criticism of the State of Israel, not Judaism specifically, which is why there's a counter definition, the Jerusalem Declaration, which honed in on the fact that we should actually just be focusing on anti-Jewish hate. And I think the current definition of Islamophobia, in a sense, is missing the trick here, which is that we have a wider message, I think, than, mimicking the experience of the Jewish nation, which we cannot mimic because of the history of that. We have a much more positive, I think, message to give to people. And I think that means we need to reassess how we use the real phenomena of anti-Muslim hate and Islamophobia, and how we can channel that into presenting our case as a faith community, spiritually, morally, ethically, and even economically. We have a lot to say. And I think it stifles it if we start to play the victim card. Even though it's natural, normal to do that, I think it's a cardinal mistake as a community that we do that. And I think at some point we have to stop and think as a community.
And I remember you saying that certainly, I think in Scotland, you were wondering, or the people that are working on some of these definitions hadn't spoken to scholars or hadn't spoken to Islamic kind of religious figures, and just I guess
I think
it's getting a holistic perspective on these things, because I think
I know the people that worked on the definition. I mean, I think it was the Runnymede Trust initially did the initial heavy lifting on the Islamophobia definition. The people involved, I know them, and I think that the problem is that scholars cannot engage in that kind of discussion in a way that they're taken seriously. It's not nuanced enough. It's not precise enough for that arena. So there's a reason why they're sidelined in some way. And so one of the big problems, I think, in the Muslim community in the UK and in Europe, not as much in America, is that there's no onboarding of scholarly voices on the types of boards and committees that deal with these types of questions.
Zara, do you find that, like, do you think there is a disconnect between all the stuff that's going on in the kind of the political sphere and, the stuff that you're probably in the high level kind of meetings, and how much of that is informed from, apart from having maybe a token person to come up for an Eid dinner, or, a scholar? Is there engagement with scholars, and do you get a sense of that, or is that
well, I wanted to, there's 2 points, so I wanted to pick on Osama's point too.
Yeah,
I also
talk
thought
about whatever you
let's
want.
pick. No, I thought because you made a very bold statement actually that on the, which I do agree with, how we've communicated Islamophobia. And did you say has failed, or is not? So it's up to that effect, or it's not been because I actually
It's not going to work.
Yeah, when I came on board at the MCB, and then I'll come on to the scholars, pick on Shaykh Ruzwan after that. When I came on board, it was so depressing, the Islamophobia rhetoric. And it just hasn't gone very far.
What do you mean depressing?
As in, it's a victim. The paradigm is kind of a poor us. I mean, we present hard-hitting stats. They're true. That's not even all of it, because we don't report hate crime, especially our communities. So there's a lot of hard-hitting stats. There's a lot of kind of what we don't have and why we don't have it, and it's always the negative. And I remember a very prominent professor said to me, "So what does a reality look like without it?" what are we actually working towards, right? And I remember struggling at the time to think of it because I've been so programmed with the why it is so bad and it's kind of like, well, what do you want to see the shift? Like, what does that look like for education? What does that look for, like, what does that actually look like for us to change? And the reason I wanted to pick on that point is I think the problem is that there's not a lot of, because we've kind of joined we followed a certain path on this one. Now we kind of need to decide if we want to stay on it or take on the pathways and points. But it is like, to shake it up will cause, and that's one issue. The other is how is it translating to the audience we're trying to affect the change too, right? So I do loads of these sessions to the Janices and the Kellys and everybody else, whether it's a big corporate company, because I'm obviously a celebrity now, so I get invited. And I talk to them about it with my own lived reality, like the interview that I went on or my experiences. And I say, my very nature being a female, Muslim woman in leadership, very visible, that breaks a lot of stereotypes. And they're like, yeah, you're right, because it's not something they thought about. And so talking about it in a way that makes people come closer to where you're trying to get. I'm not saying this is the perfect example for all scenarios. There's a place for the law and hate crime, and that's the hard stuff. But what about the institutional stuff? What about cultural capital and social capital? So I think in time, hopefully, inshallah, that will come about, and maybe as more of us come to the table. And the scholarly point is really tricky as well, because it becomes political again. Which scholars do you go to? How do you include them all? Then it becomes another like, oh, you went to that one, you didn't go to that one. And it's very tricky. I've always tried to engage scholars, but then, as you know, right, it's either we're not taking you seriously or vice versa, because how we're seeing, so for example, it might be we're looking at how is it going to land with media, how is it going to land with politicians, how is it going to land with community, and the balance of that may be very different from the imams or the scholars, and so in some ways we're all subject to a political trial, or public trial I should say, to our own community and congregants. Not everybody gets the privilege of saying whatever they like whenever they want, because otherwise no one's going to follow you, so we could be, it's a tightrope. But we have to be bold and courageous to push a little bit, but also to identify that sometimes the people we're taking along in the journey, maybe they're not quite there yet. And also from the policy side of things, that's where it's interesting, is the definition and the idea of a definition being accepted is only one part of that process. There also has to be combating it. And so I think we've got lots of different challenges on that front. So I'm not saying it because I have the answers, but because I'm actually also thinking, so Osama put lots of thoughts in my head as well, which is like, if at this moment we decided to do Islamophobia differently, how would we do that? Right, that's the question.
What would you guys come back with then on Zara's points?
Yeah, that's the point, right?
I mean, it's a very valid point. Like, which scholars do you go to? Are they representative? Scholars are not a homogenous group. There's no such thing. So, how would you solve Zara's problem? She's saying that I want to engage on many issues in MCB. I've got hundreds of mosques, hundreds of organizations. What's my process to get that scholarly input, opinions?
So it depends what you want.
Because you live amongst the scholars, the caliber and the expertise between them. Yeah,
it depends it depends on expertise, isn't it? A scholar by definition is nothing special apart from an access to an expertise built over time, added to experience and added to a sense of longevity of this whole process. I mean, that whole idea of history. And so that gives a different perspective, say, on Islamophobia, where it's the statistics are shocking, but then it's a question of, okay, what do we want to achieve? Or more to the point of what do we want to convey to people that don't know about who we are? So that's on the basis of the fact that we're a religion that wants to give people access to what we have. So you don't want to frustrate that. So for a scholar, essentially, the most important thing would be you don't want to frustrate the primary function of us as a community, which is to convey a message, which is of benefit to the people that will hear it, not to ourselves. So we're not a chosen people, by definition. We are a people that are chosen to give the message to other people, but not special in ourselves. So we can stray, and we're responsible for straying. And so I think the issue is that scholars may have an expertise, like in the application of Islamic law in minority situations, for example, in which case you'd go to an expert. And that's not going to be restricted by the fact he's or she's part of some organization is based on the fact that they have expertise. So they're invited to a committee, a working group. It's on the basis of their expertise, not on the basis of their affiliation to a group that represents 700 mosques, for example. So I think that's how you get around it, is you have to earn the respect through your expertise.
Okay.
Yeah.
Osama, you've started a,
Trouble.
Look,
shaking the hornet's nest.
so the question is, what should we do about Islamophobia?
The question is lots of points of what you've heard, what your thoughts and.
I think let's be constructive, and I think if anyone's doubting that change is possible, look at the example from the LGBT community. You go back decades, and if we think the Muslims are demonized, LGBT people in this country faced much worse. It was dangerous, and the Stonewall riots is where the fight back began. And this was a case where an LGBT bar was raided by the police and people were badly beaten. And in the aftermath of that, activists got together and thought, what are we going to do? Now, what did they do? Did they organize a campaign against homophobia and to talk about homophobia as the chosen frame? They did not. And I think we know what they did. That's where Pride was born. So rather than take on a victimization slant and appear in the media and complain about being victims, they literally took to the streets in a sea of color and rainbows and invited people to join them. And people did. And it wasn't built overnight. This took years and decades of sustained activity. And I think that's, now, I'm not saying we necessarily need to hit the street, but we need to think about this. What's the iconography of that? What's the tactics and the approach? And the approach is positivity, inclusion, working with people.
Do you think
we're going to have mechanisms to do that. Of course, it was planned.
Was it planned, or did people
yes, this was
organic?
This was a deliberate, smart campaign.
It's documented, it's planned. I mean, the iconography, the flag, everything was well planned.
Because you've spoken about it in one of your
courses
as well.
I've spoken about it.
But sorry to interrupt, Osama, carry on here. So you're saying...
So I think what I'm talking about here is not pie in the sky. So what we've taken is, over the last number of years, an approach trying to mirror what the Jewish community do about their fears. But their situation is, I believe, unique. And I don't think other communities can mirror that. And also, it's not within our way to adopt that frame either, because we have to be about a positive message, and that positive message can work. And other communities have shown that. And I think we do need to hold the course. We need to come up with, okay, what's the narrative? What are the tactics? And rebuild. It can be done.
So just to challenge you on that, I mean, somebody might say, well, look, Muslim women are getting their hijabs pulled off. In schools, your Muslim children are getting treated differently, or, the recent case of you pray or not. It's a very real in terms, people are maybe getting discriminated about their jobs. So it's great to have like a very positive message, bring people on board. But the reality is there's also, so how should those issues get dealt with? What, just through the law? And if there's something illegal happening, but because you can say, look, send a very positive message, but I guess part of the reason why it's a kind of victim mentality is because people are saying, well, my brother, my sister, me is being discriminated on a daily basis. I'm getting treated differently because of my faith, because I'm a Muslim. And, that needs to be dealt with and recognized, doing, a positive campaign, a feel-good campaign, how's that going to help me when I'm getting...
It's an emotional reaction when what you're describing happens. But there's a logical fallacy to it. So what people are doing when they complain about victimization is saying nobody cares about us. And you're shouting that into a void where you're saying nobody cares. So you have to make people care. People have got to have some degree of sympathy, empathy, love, care, and that's what's got to be built. And that really can only happen through storytelling, which is more positive. I don't think we've earned victim status. and we're not going to earn victim status unless something, and I don't even want to describe what needs to happen for that. But the Jewish people went through what they went through. So, and as I said, the LGBT community went through the same. They were attacked on the streets. They were beaten up by the police. They were worried about their lives and their loved ones. So they went through all of that, and they've come through that. So there's a pathway. We've got to think about that and build from there.
Maybe just to add, I think it comes down to the story of Islam and Muslims in Britain, how we tell the story ourselves to ourselves and how we tell it to others. So I think what the point Osama is making is that you can look at the wound, the bleeding, and you can just bandage it and keep bandaging it. You could take a step back and say, how do we just make this whole thing healthy? And those Islamophobic incidents are a reference point to where someone sees you as something else or an othering. But for some people, they never met a Muslim, or their only framing of a Muslim is in a negative context. So they see this and they're offended or scared. We know all these things. But the point being is, how are we offering other narratives, other conversations? And it's a long game. So that stuff of being the present victim is there. It has to be tackled and challenged. But the longer game is how you tell the bigger story. And I think it comes down to Islam in some ways, and that the Islam in the West paradigm, the who we are. There was loads of identity politics. I think a lot of that's faded. But if you bring it back up again, you're saying, that whole British Muslim identity stuff, not for the non-Muslims, I think for ourselves, actually. And what I think the Gaza, Israel, all this stuff has highlighted to me personally is the story we tell. I'm more fearful sometimes of the community response to what I say, right, if not all the time, than I am of media, right? Because if you're looking past the presenter, you're not trying to persuade him, you're persuading your audience. Mm-hmm. You know how things are going to land, right? If I know I can connect to that person, but maybe someone in my community doesn't think I'm resonating the fervor of my message, the Piers Morgan essentially approach, I'm not getting the sound bites that I need and everyone can go viral on, then there's a bit of a dysfunction. There's a marred reality, and some of that is around us deciding who we want to be in the present moment as well as in the long term, but also deciding if we're all willing to be part of the journey. Because if a few of us agree, right, yeah, let's do it, but nobody wants to come with us, and we might just be having our own podcast in this little cozy room in the Ark.
And I guess that was my next. Shaykh, were you going to come out?
No, it's about what Zara was saying. It's a question of courage, isn't it? Like at certain points, you as a person, if you feel you need to say something that will essentially not land well with your expected constituents in your own community, are you a type of person that will still say it because to be true to yourself, you have to say it? So I think that's where people that have the ability to amplify their voices, they have to make that choice for themselves and where they have the courage to do that. I think that's just really so important, because alternative voices are what we need to hear. I never like to exist within an echo chamber where I know everybody's going to be saying what I'm saying. I'll be reading the pro-Zionist voice and seeing, okay, what are they saying? Why are they saying it? I need to recalibrate what I'm thinking based upon what that tells me about their perspective. And if I have a conversation with somebody and they're the complete antithesis of what I am, I still listen, hoping to learn. And that comes down to yourself as a person. Do you have the courage to do that and to take it on in the neck from your community? And I think that's just what disappoints me is people that should be doing that, not doing it, because otherwise you just stagnate within your own echo chamber.
Yeah. And just I know we'll need to kind of conclude things shortly. So what I'm curious about, there's so much I've learned from today's discussion is, is it a forum? Where are these discussions happening? Are they? I'm hopeful that there's some really intelligent people, which there are, working on this, discussing this, doing it, and how we can support them. Because I think that's. So is that happening? And is there those discussions you're talking about, Osama, strategy, how we approach things. People in very senior positions, you know, they'll all be in your phone book, Zara. They'll, Sheikh, people come for you for advice, etc. Is there a structure, is there a platform? Does it need to be as organized, or is it more organic? I don't know. This idea of, okay, there's a short term that we're dealing with just now, both with Palestine, Islamophobia, all these issues which are the present, which is okay. But, there's always medium and longer term. And who's working on that? Who's developing that? Where's the forum, the structures,
I think we're all doing our bit. I mean, I would say it's very difficult to answer that because it's not a WhatsApp chat where we're all, maybe we need to create one and it can be leaked in the Guardian.
They exist, but they're not worth being on.
Yeah, I think they seem to be caught out. I mean, I think with sincerity, we're all thinking about it. Perhaps all agree. But it's difficult when you're navigating the present to bring all the right voices. The problem is everyone's always suspicious of everybody. Everyone's posturing, or really they just want to push their... I don't know. I think there's a lot of good, well-meaning people that are trying, whether it's within the space that they occupy or with others. I don't think there's one forum, because we as a community are very, very diverse, or one space, but probably it's a good call to action anyway. But I think it's challenging for lots of different reasons, especially if for some people it's, well, I don't really want to do this unless we're actually going to do it. Which is a fair ask, right? I don't want to just talk about this anymore. So a lot of our community feel frustrated. We've had these meetings, we've had these conversations. What's really changed? Yeah. Then, that whole disillusionment comes back.
Sam, because I remember when first hearing a bit about the whole New Labour kind of project, and it was very much, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, a few people said, this is what we need to do to change the Labour Party, this is what we're going to do, they had the strategy, and then they got the right people, a small team around them, and then they took it in a certain direction, and I'm not saying mimic that, but there was clear kind of, what needs to be done. And obviously Muslims is not a political party, or it's just, it's more diverse and complicated that. But what's your kind of sense? Where is the leadership that is saying for the Muslim community, this is the discussion, this is where we need to take it forward? And if it's not there, why is it not there, and what needs to be done?
What we're talking about here is people power, which is quite different from hard power. So Israel is waging a military campaign on Gaza that needs centralized function and strategy and delivery. People power is quite different. People power, modern people power, is disaggregated, and people are empowered to take action. And that's the flavor of modern movements, whether you talk about the movement for Black Lives, the climate justice movement, the Me Too movement, they've made massive social and societal change over the last number of years, and huge impact and change for people. And I think when we're talking about the movement for peace in the Holy Land, whether it's building understanding of Muslims and coexistence between different communities, that comeback started. That's ongoing. I mean, what I've been seeing, particularly since in the last few months, is people getting together. Some of that's happening in a sort of organized way through organizations, but I'm just seeing people using whatever influence and platforms they have on a local level, national level, global level. Let's end this conversation the same way we began it. Things are not going to be the same again after this. People have woken up, and I'm seeing that happening. I think really important things have already happened. I think even more important things are going to happen, and they're going to emerge from everywhere, and that's good. I think we need to get away from this. There needs to be some basic element of coordination and cooperation. I think Muslims need to get better at that, but it doesn't need to be one entity. And I think we've got to learn lessons from that as well. When there has been attempts in the past, that's easily taken down and in very brutal ways. So there's real disadvantages to that, and real advantages to letting people get on with it, and I think that's exactly what's happening.
Excellent. Sheikh?
Yeah, I would just reiterate that sentiment. I think we all have spheres of influence that we can utilize, and people have inputs that they can do, and there's, just happens. I mean, if you create a forum for something, I think it's much more difficult to sustain it, because it's one amongst many forums that are essentially saying that they're doing the same thing. I think you need to be much more true to yourself. And I think we can do it organically as well, through personal contacts. Because at the end of the day, communication is a lot about the person you're speaking to themselves rather than the message itself. It's about the degree of trust you have with somebody. The advice you give them is as good as you are in that person's eye.
Okay. So I think we'll need to bring things to a close. Any final kind of comments or thoughts people had?
I hope people are still optimistic. No, I think it's been a very thought-provoking conversation. Obviously, it spurred lots of thoughts on for myself as well, which is really good. And I think it comes down to maybe when we talk about community leadership, we also need to think about whether we're willing to follow wherever that leadership comes from. And the interesting question you asked us was really poised, I think, around this idea that one person is leading that direction, but obviously we can't agree on that. Never mind agreeing on, because I know. So I was just thinking that, organized leadership, and the point that Osama made is just kind of self-organized or not even organized. All of them can exist. But the point being is, are we willing to be good faith partners? And I think all the points we covered today is around opening your mind to considering what kind of partner are you. So I could say I'm the head of this really big organization, we represent everybody, but you might be like, well, but I'm not following you, even on Instagram, so I could say I've done all these interviews, or we're these experts and scholars, whatever, right? But I don't follow you. I don't subscribe to your kind of madhab or whatever it is. So the point being is, what's really important at the end of the day is whether we're trying to do the right thing at this moment, and whether what we're doing is really helpful and beneficial. And it's that idea I don't think anybody desires to not do that, but it's taking that introspection to say, where is it landing? Who am I helping? And am I even helping myself? And everybody right now is in a lot of pain. That was the final thing I wanted to say, is that I know we've said some very cutting things today, and we're not being dismissive of anybody or any views, or not saying that we ourselves are capable of strategizing and everything more than anybody else is, but people are in pain right now. That's a real pain. People are traumatized. People are hurting. And in no way should that be undermined, And I think what we're reflecting on is conjecture and speculation, but understanding that everybody has a heart at the end of the day. We take that into consideration, even ourselves, to try and do the best that we can. But thank you so much, Mark. It's been a very pleasurable conversation.
No, thank you, Zara. It's been fascinating to hear some of your insights as well. Osama, any kind of closing thoughts or reflections?
I don't think I have anything further to add, other than it's been a great conversation, and I feel exhausted taking part in this, but it's been enjoyable. Thank you.
Excellent. Sheikh?
I mean, you have to acknowledge everybody's contribution. I think that's what's really important. I think from my perspective, Allah says in the Quran, whoever desires the hereafter, which is essentially not about this world, it's about the hereafter and your destiny there, وَسَعَى لَهَا سَعْيَهَا, but also puts in the effort, which means it's here. So this is a real conversation we're having about the challenges and the decisions we have to make in our actions. And he's a believer in God. That person's actions will be accepted with gratitude by God. So whatever we do, whether we're thinking high level or we're just people doing what we quote unquote consider to be menial interventions, in the eyes of God, they're exactly the same. And in fact, far greater. And that goes back to your point of, can we be followers as well? Everyone wants to be a thought leader or have their voice heard, but essentially we have to train ourselves to be people that can follow. And where that comes out in the seerah is the Prophet sent. His final army was Osama bin Zayd, who was early teens, at the head of an army which contained Abu Bakr and all the most illustrious companions at the end of their lives, but he told them to follow. I mean, every time I read that, it's difficult to understand. For us, it's, well, he's the best after the Prophet, and then he's the best, and then he's the best. But no, it's also a message to ourselves, which is that we have to be able to follow and swallow that pill is very difficult for people. So I think, yeah, definitely, I think wherever the call to action comes and the person speaks the truth, we should be ready to answer that call.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh, lovely way to end. So thank you to all my guests. So just to say, if we have been very frank in a lot of discussions. It's obviously not meant to upset or hurt anyone, but really wanted to think and speak in an open space really about a lot of the issues that are facing us, and if there are any shortcomings, please forgive us. But I hope you enjoyed some of these reflections. If you did, please do comment, like, subscribe, all the usual stuff you hear at the end of a podcast. But if you like this format, then let us know as well. We would welcome feedback, because we could do more of this type of format, or otherwise there'll be other different type of things on the Muslim-Centric podcast. So Jazakallah khair to all our guests, and thank you very much for listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum salam.